Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm joined again today with Nicholas for another episode where we're planning on going through a few topics. So to start the episode, we're going to talk a little bit about police funding and recent changes that were influenced by crime in Chinatown. We're all going to move into labor and focus most of the episode talking about some new changes to labor that are happening in Alberta, talking about the value of workers in the province and generally across Canada, and a little bit also about the worker resistance that's happened, just based on some of the labor practices, but also certain events that have taken place in Alberta. So yeah, Nicholas, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. I think it's good to be finally doing an episode where we're able to touch on some more of these topics. I think even just in personal conversations and in what we've kind of been paying attention to in the world around us, we've seen a lot of stuff around the labor movement, and a lot of stuff has just become a lot more pressing, obviously over decades, but especially over the last couple of years here and throughout the pandemic, and even you could say exacerbated in the last few months, so-called coming out of the pandemic. Yeah, it's just like a topic that we care a lot about and that we want to touch on more in this podcast. So yeah, glad to be talking more about that in this episode. But yeah, I definitely wanted to follow up from a lot of what we had discussed in the last episode regarding the police and municipal response to violence in Chinatown, and just those all too familiar cycles of growing police power. Just earlier this week, Edmonton City Council voted to increase the city's budget for the police to an astounding $407 million. So we finally broke that ceiling, past $400 million. And that was also approved by City Council in a vote of 12-1. So this was not a split decision whatsoever. That's pretty much the entire City Council.
Mm-hmm. And I think to add insult to injury, as cliche as that may sound, here's a quote from Andrew Knack specifically about how the city is proposing to raise property taxes in order to make up for police budget shortfalls, essentially. So here's a quote from Andrew Knack, quote, "I think there's a lot of folks who would understand that if we have a declining fund that is no longer getting the same amount of money that was going to help, in part, the police, that they'll be okay with their tax dollars offsetting that amount to make them whole again." So when he says them, I'm assuming that he's referring to police. And I feel like this comment especially kind of got to me when I read it, just because of how much it just speaks for people. Obviously, these politicians represent us, but I don't think they often take the chance to speak so explicitly in the shoes of people by saying that we'd be okay with spending more money for this $400+ million service. Yeah, pretty rich if you ask me. I certainly don't want my money going towards more police, and I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of people feel the same way. But Andrew Knack obviously disagrees. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear that. We're dealing with a little bit of traffic noises here. I'm not really sure what that is, but I actually thought that it wouldn't be as loud now that the Oilers are out of the playoffs, thankfully. But yeah, we're still dealing with a little bit of that over here, I guess. But yeah, very disturbing comments from Andrew Knack. Those were actually comments that he provided the week before the vote to increase the police budget. So I guess at that point he was just kind of speculating. And I remember seeing this article where he made these comments saying that Edmontonians are going to be willing to pay more, and just seeing that as kind of an ominous sign for council's support for a greater police budget, and of course that ended up coming to fruition. So it's also, guess I would say, disturbing just how quickly this all happened. After, a couple years ago, you saw councillors hashtagging BLM, feigning basically their solidarity with marginalized and oppressed communities who have experienced and vocalized their concerns about police brutality and lack of police accountability. It's been very quick to make a full 180 and now enthusiastically support greater police power directly at the cost of citizens or of the people here who are going to be policed, and especially from councillors like, I guess, Andrew Knack, who I would say Andrew Knack is typically thought of as a more liberal or at least like center-left city councillor. So definitely to hear this kind of rhetoric from him is just an indicator of how clear the support for police funding and police power is on our city council currently.
Yeah, this 180 definitely has me pretty depressed, if I'm being completely honest, because thinking back to how much lip service was given towards, police reform, people talking about defunding in a relatively serious term. And even a few weeks ago, City Council was debating on whether or not they should continue to adopt the police funding formula, which we know has kept police funds going up for years now. They also were debating freezing the budget. So that was on the table. It seemed like it was going to be a pretty close vote. The vote got moved and pushed to a few months later, so they had more time to, I think, investigate the funding formula. And then in the meantime, essentially what we saw was some pretty open public political pressure coming from a few places. Coming from the police union, we saw a lot of weaponizing this violence in Chinatown, disorder on the LRT transit system and on transit generally. Those things were directly used to essentially, justify more police funding, blame these problems on a supposed defunding of the police when we know that they've received more money, and essentially also put in this false notion that the solution to these problems is, of course, more police, which I think we all know these problems existed before and they will continue to exist, even though we've continued to increasingly fund police. And the other kind of side of public pressure on council definitely came from the Justice Minister, Tyler Shandro. So he came in and if we can find the clip here, it might be useful to play, but I'll try to paraphrase it, and essentially had a press conference announcing more money for Crime Stoppers, $800,000 over 3 years for this Crime Stoppers organization. And during the press conference, he talked about Chinatown, got a bunch of facts wrong about what's going on with police funding in Edmonton, what happened with certain crimes in Edmonton, but still criticized council heavily, said that the province would step in if council didn't take police funding seriously and didn't come up with what they later requested, which was a plan to address public safety. So all of this public pressure, council folded and they gave the police exactly what they wanted, and basically unanimously did so. So very disappointing. I think it maybe shows how little we should probably invest in council and how much importance should be put in trying to find alternatives, as difficult as that is, because I'll be the first person to acknowledge the fact that thinking of alternatives and implementing alternatives to what we currently have is incredibly difficult, but I think it's worth starting that difficult work for sure.
Yeah, I think the way you laid it out, I think is I guess I would say, the logical narrative, or that's kind of how it played out in the media. Not to get all conspiracy theory here, I say this word all the time, but it is very sinister how that sequence of events happened. And it's hard to not think that that was very deliberate. And just going back to, because there's just a goldmine of Andrew Knack quotes on this subject here. Andrew Knack acknowledged the city heard calls to reform policing and boost money for alternatives in the 2020 public hearings. And he would like to see how the city can fund more safety programs alongside police. Recently, though, he's also heard from others that EPS should get even more money, he said. So the way that the Edmonton Journal covered that here, and the way that Andrew Knack is spinning the narrative, seems very deliberate in order to try and pivot the messaging towards clear support for police. So I do think that it's hard to not see this whole sequence of events as a very deliberate attempt to pivot public discourse and I guess, as they would hope, public sentiment towards greater support for police. And as we now know, that resulted in an increase to the police budget, where the city's now giving them $407 million. And the council is in support of returning to this kind of Don Iveson funding formula, which basically guarantees the police more money every year, or this reliable base amount of money for their budget that we basically just trust them with. So yeah, that's where we are now. And there's some more quotes from City Council alongside this article announcing the increase. Councillor Ashley Salvador saying the base amount will provide certainty. It's very clear Edmontonians absolutely expect us to deliver policing as a basic core service and adequately fund police. Again, these very kind of deliberate quotes that are meant to drive public sentiment in favor of the police. Even Aaron Paquette, another councillor who I think is largely thought of as a more liberal or center-left councillor, he's saying, yeah, times are changing and the way we do policing is changing, but we still need to basically give the police this money so that they can continue to do their job in the meantime. So I guess trying to downplay concerns from the community, or trying to push this more pragmatic approach kind of messaging. And, Sarah Hamilton here is trying to make the argument that the funding formula will actually make the police service take on more financial risk. And what she says is, it makes the police more accountable because they have to give their best estimate on the resources they need to provide policing to the community. That's just so clearly wrong. Basically writing the police a blank check that keeps getting bigger every year absolutely does not make the police more accountable. Omar, what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I don't know where that kind of thinking goes in, but if anything, it reminds me more and maybe brings me more to your side of conspiracy theory kind of stuff, where it's this narrative is being pushed out and then everything is just being made to fit within that, regardless of if it's true or not, because this idea that somehow, because the police have to report what they need because that's the way that they get money, that's going to keep them more accountable, completely ignores the fact that their budget is completely private, essentially. We don't get, this line by line breakdown.
Yeah, sorry. And just to interrupt, the things we do know, we just found out today, the police chief's salary is $340,000. Mm-hmm. That itself is obviously peanuts compared to the whatever $4 million they're spending on a new plane. Mm-hmm. The millions that was it $1 million that they spent on that tank?
Something like that. Yeah, no.
Anyways, And even as we, or maybe we didn't mention this on a previous episode, but the counselor Karen Principe or whatever said, "Oh, I don't know where the police budget goes, but if they say they need a plane, then I trust that they need a plane." So clearly, there's no accountability going on here. Even the city councilors don't know where the police budget goes, where this $400 million goes, and they don't even question kind of egregious spending on things like a plane.
And so what council might say here in this whole conversation about accountability, when they refuse to hold this accountability, I think a lot of the times what happens is they say, oh, this is the police commission's job. You know, we're just here to do what the police commission recommends. But then you have councilors like Councillor Sarah Hamilton, who is on the police commission, who's bringing up all these red flags about lack of accountability, lack of transparency on the police commission, and gets directly attacked, multiple times, and is called out for employing someone who's supposedly anti-police, and somehow her employment of this person is, a conflict of interest, and this is a reason why she shouldn't be on the commission. Or people going after Michael Jans, for example, repeatedly. And I feel like these are just cases to show that, we can pass on the blame, and then when we get to situations where people are actually accountable, then we can just move in and just, try to remove people who have the actual power or are on these commissions that are supposed to control the police. And those commissions are, again, tightly controlled, and people who do have these concerns or who raise these flags, get complaints filed against them that are almost always baseless. But I think also serve as a good intimidation tool, as a good, tool to put pressure on people to make them realize that, there are consequences for the critiques that they level. And this new term that people like to throw around of anti-police, as if, there's this dichotomy of, pro versus anti, and not just a very clear understanding and analysis of the situation that we're in, and a realization of what the solutions are needed to get out of that situation.
We're anti though.
Yeah, no. Yeah. If we're going to think in those terms, I think you can guess what we are, but I'll proudly wear that badge, because quite honestly, I don't think that, it can have the negative impact that the people who use it, think it would, at least not on my life. But yeah, it's a sad state that we're in for sure.
Yeah. And I also just want to mention that the whole idea of returning to the funding formula, I think why that's really important, and why something that the police would really push for, is that in itself is really a way of driving public sentiment in favor of the police. So just to explain that a little more, some things that we've pointed out in the past are just the way that the media tends to cover any kind of change to the police budget. If the police budget is increased, but perhaps not as much as they were expecting, the way the headlines are run is that they are getting less than they expected. So it sounds like they're getting a cut in their budget, and that makes people think that the police are under attack. That allows the police to come out and say that they're under attack, and that then drives public sentiment in favor of the police. To explain why, I guess in this case, they increased the city's police budget from $385 million to $407 million is apparently because the police used to get a certain amount of money from photo radar that I guess going forward, the province is going to be keeping more of that money. So in order to make up for that, I guess the city is going to be paying that money and now giving the police $407 million. And I think that's the ostensible reason given for it, but I think that money actually even more than makes up what they said they would be out due to the lack of money from photo radar. Oh, yeah. So anyways, that's a little bit of context here, but that money from photo radar isn't something that was part of the public discussion before. Like, I think before we just thought, oh, okay, $385 million for police, that's an enormous amount of money. We're not thinking that they're also getting additional money there from photo radar. So to come back now and say, oh, well, we actually were getting this $20 million from photo radar. So now that we're not going to get that going forward, or potentially not going to get that, the city needs to give us more money. That's kind of just moving the goalposts here. And the way that this discussion was covered when the media was writing about council's upcoming decision to either increase the budget to match this loss of revenue from photo radar or not, the whole way the media was framing it is like, is the police gonna potentially lose this money? So again, the police or the media really has this tendency to cover things in a way that drives public sentiment towards police, and introducing a funding formula back into the mix just creates this increasing baseline for expected police funds against which the media is always going to measure further discussions or changes to the police budget. So it's always going to seem like the police budget is under attack, or that the police are getting budget cuts, when in reality that number is just going up and up and up.
Mm-hmm. And like, just to touch on like a quick point on the media there, I think that was like really good media analysis, in the sense that a lot of newsrooms, a lot of the beats, a lot of the stories, and the manpower that's put towards covering things is done in kind of favor, or is beholden to these institutions like the police. So the center of stories, or the focus of stories, is always going to be in that position of what is threatening this institution, what is this institution's interests, where are they positioned in relation to how they used to be or how they might be in the future. And the position of like a regular citizen, of someone who's marginalized on the streets who might be policed, victims of police brutality. These are all separate, maybe unique, one-off stories. These aren't a part of, I think, the typical main narrative unless they're inserted in there. When, we have regular stories or regular coverage of City Hall budget decisions, police lobbying City Hall for more funding, or general budget conversations. So yeah, I feel like that framing is also almost like an inherent part of the way news is built up and its history, really.
Yep. So we'll try and keep a good pulse on what's going on here, but looks like we're sticking to the unfortunate status quo here. Mm-hmm.